Hello, everyone. My name is Connor Felty, and I would like to welcome you back to COGS Devotions. We started this at the beginning of our launch of the Gospel Project, and we just had to take a break because things got really crazy around the holiday season. We were having some technical difficulties, but now we are ready to go in this new year. You'll notice if you usually follow us on YouTube that this is an audio-only episode. We are still having technical difficulties with our visual system, so thank you for bearing with us, and we'll be back with you showing our beautiful faces soon. This week, we are picking up with the fourth lesson of the second unit of the Gospel Project, and what we're looking at is the beginning of Israel's story in Egypt. So this is kind of the classic calling of Moses text. I'm here today with Matt Gettle. He was with us earlier, and I'm actually going to just go ahead and ask him, Matt, since we just moved through Christmas, what is your favorite Christmas tradition?
My favorite Christmas tradition would have to be the candle lighting that we do at the end of our Christmas Eve service. That's always kind of a special time where you get to kind of reflect on the year and kind of just be able to appreciate the majesty of the night and just kind of appreciate what happened at that time and just sort of be with yourself and just that little candle and just kind of focus solely on that. And so that would have to be my favorite little Christmas tradition.
Yeah, it's so entrancing. It really is a moment that is so special and that really stands out from the rest of the year and even our other celebrations at different special times in the church calendar. So thank you for sharing. Glad to have you back.
Glad to be back.
And we will dive in here. So the story, for those of you who haven't been able to dive into a class with us, we've wrapped up the book of Genesis in each of our Gospel Project groups. And at the end of the book of Genesis, there's this great famine that kind of consumes the whole Middle East where the events of the story are taking place. And so God sends Jacob and his sons into Egypt, where God is going to bless them with food that Joseph, their brother, is able to provide for them. We get the famous passage that says, but God intended it for good. Joseph says to his brothers as he's able to bless them. So Israel, at the end of Genesis, is being blessed in Egypt. And then we pick up at the beginning of Exodus, and centuries have passed, and now Israel is being cursed in Egypt. It is now a place where they're being oppressed, they're enslaved, they're having baby boys slaughtered, all because Pharaoh is afraid of a slave uprising. And so it's into that story that we really jump in. And there are so many points in this story where we're able to relate in fresh ways with Israel, even though maybe we're not living in a time when our government is totally against us in every way possible. So there's a lot of struggle at the beginning of the book of Exodus, and Israel is really quite concerned that their God has forgotten them, that Isaac and Jacob is no longer with Israel. And so I was just wondering, maybe from you, Matt, what can you imagine them feeling at this point in the story?
Sense of hope? I don't know. I feel like there's got to be something better. There would have to be something inside of me that, although there isn't much hope, you kind of have to think that, okay, this really is a terrible situation. It's very hard for me to kind of wrap my head around it because I don't think that I would have ever, given my status and my race, I would have never been in this situation, never could imagine anything like that. So, yeah, I would imagine just kind of a sense of hopelessness and just kind of constantly looking for a way out.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of times I can kind of relate to this on a more personal, emotional, spiritual level of being in that place of despair. It may not be for the same reasons. It may not always seem as impossible of a circumstance as what Israel does. But even in my day-to-day, right, have a bad day at work, or get in a fight with family, or even just go a few days without seeing a friend, and it starts to feel like, oh my goodness, like how am I going to make it through this? And I can only imagine magnifying that and multiplying that times probably near infinity, to be enslaved and to be as harshly mistreated as Israel was here. But I think you come to my gospel project class at 11 o'clock, and we had someone just make a really precise statement that I think perfectly captures the way that we have to kind of walk away from this here at this point in the story. When we're reading along through the story, we hear that God remembers his people, which doesn't mean that he had forgotten about them, but that he's ready to take action for them, that he is not going to leave them where they are anymore. Of course, Israel probably wanted that 200 or 300 years earlier, but it just raises this really important point, even for me, even with the maybe less crushing despair that I feel at times. Someone in our class had said, we are on God's time. God is not on our time. And I think that that's such an important statement to remember, is that ultimately God is working out his plan, and it's my job to consistently be looking to him and waiting on his go, on his action, on his movement and power. And so often prayer for myself and for so many people that I talk to is asking God to come into our time, to just work how I want and when I want. And
yeah, it's very seldom that we ask God to do something and then just let it go on his time. We're very self-centered in that way, that we want it, like we want our family member to be healed right now. We want our child or whatever to get onto the sports team right now. You know, you can think of any situation, kind of apply it to that. But yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying.
And this is, too, just the last note here on this part of the story is that this goes on for centuries. This lasts beyond even a single person's lifetime, that they have to go their entire life waiting on God. 100 years they're slaves, and yet they are waiting on God to move in his time.
And I really don't think that in our kind of fast-paced, instant gratification kind of culture nowadays that we understand how much faith it really took to wait 100 years for one thing to happen.
That's a really, really good point, because I just think about like those times that I go to church on a Sunday and I'm like, if this doesn't lift me up, like I'm out.
If this hour doesn't do it for my whole week, Pastor Al, you done me wrong.
Yeah, but really that is so significant in our difference in time. We can't even begin to imagine that. Thank you for making that connection. So I just want to continue along with the story here because, again, I think it's just going to be best for us to connect at different points in the story here. But after God remembers his people, he decides, in line with his whole plan throughout the Old Testament, that he's going to use a human being to accomplish this goal. He's not going to snap his fingers and cause the Egyptians to just be flooded and all die, and then the Israelites go out safe. But he's like, you know what? That insecure little man down there, Moses, that's who I want to be my great deliverer. And so I want to point out, as we move in here, at Moses and the famous story of the burning bush, right? This is a story that Christians and non-Christians alike have heard and know, at least in its basics. Moses is not worthy of this calling.
No.
Moses is not some great hero. We shouldn't be looking at Moses like, oh, I'll never be like Moses, so I shouldn't. I mean, Moses doesn't deserve this. And so God comes to him, and it's about God and what God is going to do through Moses. And so God doesn't come and say, Moses, you have so much deep within you that you don't even know. God comes and says, I am who I am. And that's the revelation of his name, that God is going to be the one who delivers Israel and protects them, because he's always been the one who has delivered and protected them. And so I want to shift that focus away from, was Moses worthy? Because the answer is very much no. He's a murderer in exile who can't speak. He doesn't deserve it. No. And yet God comes and says, I am the one who will deliver. Moses, you're going to be the vessel that I use to do it. And so I remember a conversation we had a few weeks ago. Could you just give a little bit of context about how we've been engaging with this passage recently? Because I think it's quite relatable for a lot of people.
Yeah, sure. Probably 3 weeks ago? We'll just say 3 weeks ago for sake of argument. One of my coworkers came to me, and he's not an overly religious man, but he was asking a question, and I was happy to answer him in any way that I could. And he asked me about, do you really believe all that stuff with the burning bush? And, don't you think that he was just, he just happened to find like a patch of mushrooms and he just dreamed the whole thing and God was appearing to him? And, it was kind of one of those sort of situations where maybe he stepped on some poisonous root and, he happened to have the venom flowing through his veins and it blurred his vision and something like that. And so I was trying to kind of talk with him and get him to kind of take a step back and think about, this situation wasn't just an accident, because if you keep reading and all the things that happened afterwards and all the things that came to be, you can't line all those pieces up, all those dominoes up, and get them to fall in order without God being the central component.
Yeah, and without this first moment, right?
Right.
And that's in that moment that you had talked to me 3 weeks ago, I didn't know how to answer you. There's no way. It's true of all history, right, of American history. I can't go back and tell you what was actually going on.
If you take any instance in history, it's hard to prove why anything happened the way it did in any instant. That's why you have to look at the whole picture. And that's what I was trying to get him to see.
Yeah.
I wasn't trying to belittle him or say that his question was invalid. I was just trying to say, you're looking at it this way, I'm looking at it this way, and this is why I see it differently.
Yeah, and I think that that's the real power of this story, is the fact that it plays out over time. There's not a principle here. We're not supposed to walk away and believe that God is going to come to us with some dynamic calling that is so supernatural that we can't deny it.
Right.
That's not the part we're supposed to walk away with, but that God is in the works of saving his people. And I just find that to be so compelling. And when we see how history played out, both the scriptural history, but also what archaeology is at times able to tell us about the Egyptian culture and about this strange Hebrew people who are entering Canaan around this time. All of that starts with an insecure murderer.
Who can't speak.
Yeah, we can't. It doesn't make sense that we get to all of the rest of the story unless there really was something supernatural going on here. So God calls Moses, and Moses is like, God, great, good stuff. I can't talk. Please just send someone else. And God, again, does these supernatural things to show Moses his power. And he turns Moses' staff into a snake. And Moses still is like, okay, I don't want to do this. Please send somebody else.
He keeps taking the problem that God is presenting to him, and he keeps giving him reasons why he's not able to do it, not why God should be able to do it.
Yeah.
And that's the big disconnect that he's having there.
Yeah, he's really... It's so poignant the way that this story connects with our culture, because it is the perfect counter to the narrative that we tell about ourselves. Our culture is all about discovering who you were meant to be and finding it deep down in yourself, finding the strength and the courage and the
Right.
power
It's
to
why,
do it.
It's why every American is a sucker for a good sports movie, because it's all about the comeback and the courage and the vitality of all the kids or whatever. And
I'm one of those suckers.
I am too.
So
Absolutely.
I'll confess that. But this story, God doesn't play to that narrative. Moses is playing by that narrative. He thinks that he has to prove himself in order to be worthy. And Moses is trying and failing to come up with why he should be able to do it. And so he's just asking for a way out. And God doesn't come to him. Again, I said this earlier, but God doesn't come to him and say, Moses, you know, I created you with this extra special power deep in your gut if you just access it. No, God doesn't ever say, Moses, work up the power that's in you. He says, I have the power and I'm going to give it to you. It's about what God is going to do, not what Moses wants to do or is able to do. But I love the most poignant statement that the Gospel Project made, a statement that made me stop and repeat it in class. It was just so powerful and so moving to me, right? The author said, Moses' shortcomings make God's miracles seem small. And I cannot begin to tell you how much I relate to this story. I'll speak. I know that you might have something to add, but even as just a youth pastor, and when I go and try to recruit youth leaders, the number one thing that I hear is, I'm too old, or I don't know how to relate to teens. And that way of answering the question of, do you want to serve in youth ministry, is the same kind of answer that Moses gives to God.
Right.
It's to say, I'm not worthy, and so it can't happen. Instead of saying, if God is calling me, he's going to give me the power, it's a statement of just, well, I don't think I'm the right person. It's really looking at, is it deep down within me to do this, rather than, is God calling me? Because if God is calling me, then regardless of how qualified I feel, I'm going to step out in power, in his power, to make a difference.
Right. Yeah. And I can kind of add on to that. When I was done with youth group here, I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to come back and help out. But because I kind of felt the same way. I wasn't sure that I would be that great with kids. I wasn't sure, even though I was, 19, 20 at the time. But still, you don't know if you're going to relate well to like middle school kids or younger high school kids. And I can remember that all I had to do was just go. I went one Sunday and I've been going ever since, because he has his own will and it was meant for me to be involved like that, and that's just kind of how things are. And it wasn't something that I tried to do, it wasn't something that I tried not to do, but it just happened.
Yeah. And I remember even last time you were on the week that you actually filled in for me. I was on vacation.
Oh,
and
yeah. That was a fun week.
You led the youth lesson. And I never in a million years in high school would have been like, Matt is going to grow up to be a teacher someday. But then you filled in for me, and I heard from our other leaders like, hey, Matt did a great job. And so there's just another example of like, not only did you not know if you could relate to and work with youth, but now you've moved on to teaching youth.
It only took a few years, but I got there.
Yeah. Hey, God got you there. I am loving this conversation. I could just keep on going, but I do want to just wrap up here to respect our listeners' time. But I want to close by reflecting just briefly on God's name. I am who I am. This is an identity question. This is not just a name like Connor or Matt. This is really a statement of who God is at his core. And I think that, again, this story intersects as a counter narrative to so much of what we say about ourselves in our culture today. God identifies himself. He knows himself thoroughly, and he says, I am who I am. Nothing out in the world, no circumstance, no people are going to cause me to change my character or my being. We live in a world where people are defining themselves all over the place. And I think that it's awesome to find your identity in the unique ways that God has created you. I'm not saying that it is wrong to identify by race or ethnicity or sexuality or anything like that. Those things are all kind of built into us at creation. But all of those things have to fall under another definition, another title, another identity. And that identity has to be God and who he says that we are. Ultimately, who he says every person is, a son or a daughter, a potential king or queen over creation. It's not about who God created me individually to be, but about who God calls all of humanity to be. And I have to first and foremost aim to meet God's definition of what it means to be human before I can try to fulfill my own identity, whatever that might mean. God is the only one who can define himself in all of what exists.
And I really liked the way that you described it on Sunday when you said that in Hebrew, this is defined as a universal tense.
Yeah.
When he defines himself. So it's not just I presently am what I presently am. I am also who I am, who I was in the past. I will be who I was in the past. I will be who I am in the future. And in all sorts of ways you
I
can
was
twist
who
that.
I will be in the future.
I was who I will be in the future. It's a lot of different combinations there. But the point is that universal tense means that God is always there, and he always will be, and he always has been.
Yeah.
And that was, for me, kind of eye-opening because I always sort of thought of it as just kind of like, oh, I am what I am. But and when you think about it more like across a timeline, I think it becomes a little more powerful and a little more of a declaration of like, I am here. I'm always going to be here for you.
Yeah. And I think it is the key through which Scripture becomes our story. Because if God is that constant centerpiece of Scripture, and if God is the constant centerpiece of my life, then who God was to the Israelites in Egypt, he is to me now. Who God will be in the new creation when he restores everything and there's no more tears, no more death. That is who God is now. That is what God is fighting for the world to be now. And so I get to be part of that work. It's the thread that connects all of Scripture to my individual story, to today, to this hour, to this minute, and how I try to be faithful. So much that we could talk about with this simple, 15 or 20 verses. But it's just so amazing to see a God who intersects with the world's needs, with his people's needs, and delivers them with power and reveals himself so that we could know him and to be in relationship with him. Matt, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
Yeah, always glad. You're always welcome. I'm sure that people will hear your voice several more times. And thank you to everyone who is listening. We look forward to seeing and chatting with you again next week.